Whispers from Below, a horror podcast by Justin W. Geis. Scary stories, both real and fake. Hello, listeners. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 2 of Whispers from Below, a podcast by a madman for madmen. I'm your resident psychopath, Justin W. Geis, and today's topic of discussion is ancient burial rituals. Now, before I get started with the podcast, I have one or two things I want to talk about. Number one, for those younger listeners that I told to sort of scurry off last week, this episode is totally acceptable for you. This is stuff that a lot of people learn when they're in like third or fourth grade. You learn it in elementary school. It's a little bit darker just because it involves death, but why else would you be listening to this podcast if you didn't like darker topics? So this episode is pretty chill. There's not anything in it that I would say is like really grotesque or scarring or something that would really traumatically impact your childhood. So younger listeners, older listeners, listeners of all ages, you are totally okay to be listening to this episode. Again, if you're like below the age of 5, this might not be a great podcast for you simply because it does focus on a lot of darker topics like death and things like that. So, I say listeners of all ages, but like obviously within reason, sort of like a PG-13 rating, if that makes any sense. The other thing I want to talk about is that my merch is 100% in. I have been too lazy to make myself look like a decent person. But once I do that, then I will do a little photo shoot in some of the stuff that I've bought, including stuff that you've already seen, like the notebook and the hat. And I'll be posting pictures of those on social media, so keep your eye out for that. Quarantine looks like it's going to last for way longer than anybody really wants it to. So it looks like I'm going to be uploading 2 episodes a week for a long time, so get ready for that. After I get to about 10 or 15 episodes, I might do another break for a week or two and then come back with a season 3 just so that I can keep the seasons kind of separated and make sure that they all have a similar amount of content. I know season 1 got wild. It had so many episodes, but to be truthful, I started to get burnt out. And I don't think that's good for either of us. So it's good for me to take breaks every once in a while. So I'm going to upload things faster, but then I might take like a week off and then come back and upload things even faster, if that makes sense. So without further ado, let us get into the episode. So I'm only going to be talking about 4 ancient cultures in this week's episode. There are so many different ancient cultures that I could talk about. So if you are really interested in this episode and you really, really like it, I liked doing the research for it. It was fascinating to read about it because they're so similar and yet so different, like at the same time. And we'll talk a little bit about that more towards the end. But if you really like this episode and you want to see another one with different cultures, let me know because I'd be totally down to do like a part 2 to this with more cultures. Today we're going to be talking about, in order, ancient Greece, Norse, Mayan, and Egyptian burial rituals. So we're going to start with ancient Greece. Greece and Roman funerals, I kind of plopped them together because they're similar. I'm mostly going to be talking about Greece, but for this for this section of it, it kind of goes hand in hand. Funerals are not really a huge part of the culture. It's something that is talked about and done and documented, but not as well as a lot of the other rituals and things that they did in their culture. Death was not really a huge focus for them. And so it's one of the few things that's kind of like debated about between historians as far as their culture went. But now let's get into like specifically Greece. They were usually buried in group tombs, and they had food and drink ceremonies. And they know this because they found like a bunch of food remains and broken cups around these tombs where multiple bodies were buried. It's believed that in some of these cases, they might have even sacrificed horses near the tomb because they found like horse bones and stuff. And horses were used to draw these carriages that they would have the body on. So it's believed that sometimes they would sacrifice the horse This wasn't super common, but it did happen sometimes. In the Mycenaean period specifically, they would do single graves for people that were poor, and if you were part of the elite or the richer families, you would get big family tombs where you'd be buried as a group. After this period, um, there was like a lot less of the funerals that would contain like leaving goods for the bodies. This is something that you'll see in all four rituals, is that they leave like offerings for the bodies, like for the afterlife, or for wherever they're going. All of these cultures believed in an afterlife and underworld that you would be a part of. Um, and they wanted to make sure that it was as comfortable as possible for you. So in each of these cases, you'll see that they leave like goods and stuff, but after the Mycenaean period, they started to leave less goods and focused more on the ritualistic aspect of the ceremonies. So, what's really interesting to note is that women played a really large role in preparing the body and in the funeral procession and things like that. In this time, women were not really given a lot of things to do. So, it's very interesting to note that they had such a big role to play. Um, they would prepare the body by washing the body. This all happened on the first day of death, by the way. That's important to note. On the first day of death, the women would wash the body, and then they would place a gold coin over their lips, which is interesting to note. This is explained by the fact that when you enter the underworld, you have to pay. I'm so sorry if I'm saying this wrong. Just a disclaimer: if I'm saying any of the names of gods and goddesses or any of the rituals, if I'm messing up how they're pronounced, I really, really promise that it is not disrespectful. I'm not trying to be disrespectful. I simply don't know how to say it. And I did look up how to say the things that I'm about to say, but some of it doesn't, some of the pronunciations don't really help, as well as like it's debated how it's said. So I'm going to say it one way. I'm really sorry. I don't mean to offend anybody or, disrespect the culture. This is just how I'm saying it. I'm sorry. I don't know what else to say. So they would have to pay Charon, who was the ferryman that would man the boat that went through the river Styx, that would lead you to the underworld. You had to pay him a gold coin in order to get across the river, and there was no other way to get across the river. So this is why the gold coin would be placed upon their lips so that they would have payment through the underworld. On the second day, the body would be laid out for viewing. And women, again, led like mourning. They would have these big chants. They would tear at their hair and their clothing, and they would beat their bodies up, specifically their breasts, which I thought was like a weird thing to note, is that specifically they would like pound on their own chests while doing these chants. I'm not entirely sure why. Um, but Greece was wild, baby. On the third day, a funeral procession would take place that would lead the body to its place of resting, and they would leave all sorts of offerings, whether it be food, drink, clothing, things like that. Following this, they would then cleanse the person's house with seawater and hyssop. Hyssop is like an herb that's similar to mint, for those of you that don't know. And it's really good as like a cough suppressant and things like that. Whoa. So oftentimes it's used in like herbal medicine and things like that. A feast would then follow all of this, with the dead person being the host, quote unquote. So this would mean that the person that had died would become like the host of the evening, because it would be paying homage to those that had participated in the burial of said person. So it was kind of a way to honor both the person that had died and the people that had to do all this work for this person to travel into the underworld. That's pretty much all the information we have on Greece. Again, there's not a whole lot. It wasn't super important in their culture. It was important to make sure that they could travel to the underworld, but a lot of times you'll notice that Greece is way more focused on gods of life and gods and goddesses interacting with living people. There's not a whole lot of talk about death. It's not really big in their culture. It's not something that they really talk about. They talk about the underworld. There are stories of Hades, Persephone, I'm literally stating one story. Orpheus, Eurydice. That's like the really big story for those of you that know, like Hades Town. That's the plot of Hades Town. Um, there's really big talks of stories like that where they travel into the underworld, but they come back. It's never really about them dying, if that makes any sense. Now we're going to move on to Norse mythology, which is a mythology of my people, my ancestry, which is really fun. Um, Viking age funerals, contrary to common belief, were not always sending people in a boat and cremating them. That's not, I know that that's like common phrase to be like, I want a Viking funeral, and like it means that like you get sent out in a boat and burned alive, but like that's not really what happened. Um, they were either put in like traditional graves, pretty much, or they were cremated. I mean, this was one of the first cultures that you see like actively doing cremation. And it was like a very like normal way of, giving uh a burial sort of. It's not really a burial. You're not putting them in the ground, but like cremation was a really common way of like dealing with a body. Um this was called like a ship funeral, and I'll explain that in a second of why it's called that. Um Sometimes a big wooden ship was made and then cremated, but a lot of times like this wasn't a really extremely common practice, and if it did happen, it was usually for someone very, very special in the community. Like most ancient cultures, people would leave, like, they called it grave goods around the body, to signify what's different about Norse mythology is it was more to signify what they had done in life versus giving them things to use in the afterlife. It was more like these are things that they had done, so it would be like carvings of their home or weapons that they had used in battle or things like that. Um, Even though this was a very like war centric culture, death was still very unknown and scary to them. So the rituals were important to them, and they did take a lot of care and effort into what they did. You would think that a culture that is so based around violence and war and death would be like very calm about people dying and not really care, but they took so much care and effort with how they buried and cremated bodies, um, because it was still an unknown. Just like it is today, death is a very unknown thing. Nobody really knows what happens after, and they did have some beliefs about it, but it wasn't as spoken of as in other cultures, which we'll get into. Um, Stone quote unquote ships were created when the bodies were cremated or buried, which is just that they took these really big stones and they would arrange them around the grave or cremation site in like the shape of a ship, so like a little oval with points on the end. um Sometimes these people were cremated or buried with sacrificed slaves along with some of the goods that they had. So sometimes if they were like really rich people and they had slaves with them, they would kill the slave as a sacrifice so that they could be used for their master in the afterlife. Like I said before, death was really scary to this culture, and they have a lot of legends involving like zombie-esque things rising from the graves and things like that. If you did see one of them, it meant that there was more death in your family coming. So you'll notice that a lot of bodies, if they were buried, are later dug up and decapitated or have a stake through their heart as a sort of way of like ending the life for real. No zombie, no vampire nonsense, none of that. So a lot of bodies are like sort of messed with after they're dead, which is why they started to move more towards cremation. Some of the rituals would be drawn out for days, even upwards of a week or two, while the grave was being constructed. It took a lot of time to get all those stones or to get the necessary things for the fire, things like that. It could take a lot of time. So sometimes these rituals would just be drawn out for a really long time until the grave was constructed. This involved like a lot of feasts, songs, chants, drinking, both consensual and non-consensual sex. This happened with a lot of like group rapes that would happen with women and young men in the tribe. Um, or it would be like couples having lots of group sex with other couples, and it was very consensual. It just depended on what the culture was into at the time. And even suicide was part of this ritualistic days following a death, which is very interesting because then you'd have to do it again for them. Anyway, um, sometimes they would even do mass killings of large groups of animals as like an honor to the person that had died. Again, we see in this culture that women are seen as sort of like the funerary directors, like they're really important in the funeral process. And cremation was done on a funeral pyre. And the reason that it was done on a pyre was because that way the smoke would go very, very, very high, which was intended to sort of make the spirit be elevated to a new home in the underworld, if that makes sense. Um, After 7 days, sorry, I'm dyslexic today. I don't know what's going on. 7 days after the death is what I meant to say. 7 days after their death, inheritance would be given, and they would all have another feast involving funeral ale, which was a specific ale that they would only drink 7 days after the body had been buried or cremated. Inheritance was given out, and it's interesting to note that this culture didn't really have a lot that was like written down per se, and they didn't have a whole lot of laws going on. But one thing that was very important to them was that, if so and so died, your son would get the inheritance of the home and the food and the farm and like they were very good about making sure that everything was passed down in lineage. There's a story of a girl, like all of her uncles died in war. And she was like a young girl and she got like 8 houses because she was the only person in the kin that was able to take it. So they were very methodical about how they went about giving inheritance to family members. That's it for the Norse mythology, and we're going to move on to Mayan burial rituals. So we're moving from, you know, upwards Europe, and we're going to go all the way down to South America. Fascinating stuff. Death rituals are very, 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 very important in the last two cultures we're going to talk about. Obviously, Egypt is going to have the most information on this because they were wild. But Mayan culture was very death centric. They honored the gods not for what they did, but sort of like the destructive nature that they had and what they would do in punishment. Um, those who died in a violent or painful death were considered to be transferred to heaven immediately. So if you died by suicide, complications during childbirth, if you were sacrificed or you died in battle, you were considered to be already in heaven because you were paying homage. I'm going to say that word a lot. I'm so sorry. You were paying homage to the gods. You served your sentence and you showed them how much you cared by dying painfully, which I think is really sick and twisted. Like, that is, even for a culture that would be considered more like barbaric and ancient, like, that's wild to be like, oh, you killed yourself? You're going to heaven. Good for you. That's not something that you see a lot in um any culture, really, any religious sect. You don't really see suicide being honored, but it was almost like honored in this culture, which is really fascinating. Um, those that were sacrificed, as we know, this was a thing in Aztec culture too. They usually had their heart taken out, or their blood drained, or things like that. Um, Mayan dead were placed with maize or corn in their mouths. So again, we're seeing this thing of placing something inside the mouth of the deceased. I don't know why this is such a big thing with ancient cultures, but it is. Um, and then they would also have jade or like a stone bead that would be used as currency in the afterlife that would be placed in their mouths. Royals were buried with elaborate headdresses and jewelry, and a lot of times, whatever their bloodletting artifact of choice was, which is a really weird statement. I never thought I'd be saying your bloodletting artifact of choice, but whether it would be like a stone knife or if you used a sickle or whatever, a lot of times those artifacts or bowls where the blood would be catched, a lot of times catched. Oh my god, jeez Louise, the blood would be caught. Apparently, I can't speak English today. Um, would be placed with the body. A fire was then lit above the grave that would signify the body sort of entering an ancestral plane, sort of becoming like a god among men. Um, and then an all night vigil would ensue immediately after death. So I jumped in between those statements really weirdly. I'm sorry. So that's what happens after the body is buried. Fire, ancestral. Once the body initially dies, this is a sort of process that they would take in order to bury the body. Moving on. An all night vigil would ensue immediately after death. This would have a lot of fasting. It would include gathering of grave offerings. So, again, we see them leaving offerings by the body. A lot of incense burning, along with praying for the body to sort of cleanse it. Elders would then wash the body and clothe it because being buried naked was an extreme insult in Mayan culture. Being buried naked was like an absolute no-no. If you were buried naked, you did something so wrong that the entire culture basically like banned you, shot you down. Only elders could handle the body in this culture because the soul has to forget where its home was. So after the person died, the immediate family and any friends were not allowed to touch the body. Only the elders were allowed. They would bring it to a special place for their incense and praying and all things like that. And I just thought this was a really funny image. They would spin the body around several times so that it would like lose track of its home. Like the soul would lose track of its home, which I just think is like really funny to imagine. Like all of these old people just like spinning a dead body like it's like a spinner in like Twister. Like that's how I kind of imagine it. That is so morbid. Oh my god. But just imagine like it's a big twister board and they put the body down and then the elders are like, right hand green, and then they like spin the body. That's where my brain imagined it. I was laughing for like 10 minutes while doing research earlier because I was like, this can't be real. That can't be a real thing. But it is. They do it. It's a thing. After that, they would hold a huge feast. I'm so sorry. That is so disrespectful. Apologies to anybody that is of Mayan descent. I am not trying to disrespect your culture, but that shit's funny. Like, I can't make that kind of stuff up. They would end up holding a feast after the burial of the body. And then the family home would actually end up being abandoned. They believed that after a successful trip to the underworld, the soul would have to come home and rest for 9 days. And those that were staying in the house for those 9 days could potentially also be killed by the soul. So the houses of those that had died would end up just being abandoned in the culture, and they would build a new house and they would make a new, a new home. Which is really interesting to note. Graves were either made facing north or west, which was in the directions of what the Mayans considered to be heaven, or they would be buried in cave entrances, which were considered to be entrances to the underworld, so that it made the trip down there much easier for those that had died. After this, cremation eventually became a more common use instead of burial. They just thought it was more efficient, and so they ended up doing more cremations than they did burials. That's all I really have for Mayan culture. And now, the one and only, the one that you've probably all been waiting for, how Egyptians buried people. I literally wrote as the first thing, as we know, Egyptian burials were wild, and wild is in all caps. They just did some weird things. You'll notice in this culture, before I get into it, death was so important to the Egyptians. Death was so very prevalent and important in their culture. Like, they taught you from a young age that like death is not only something that happens, but isn't it like it's inevitable and it's beautiful. And if you don't do this shit correctly, you're going to roam the earth forever and never be happy and be forced to like be in brimstone and hellfire. Like, it's very interesting. They had this belief of like Ba and Ka. Ba was like this being that would come out of the body after it died to help the family in their chores and live their life. And then when it would return to the body, Ka was the essential being like the guardian of the body that would be like, yeah, you can come back, I recognize you. Which is just something that you don't see that a lot in other cultures. It was such a death centric culture. So let's get into what they did with bodies. That being said, preservation of a dead body was extremely crucial for acceptance into the afterlife. So they were only acceptable to be presented to Osiris, who was the god of the underworld, if they were mummified. If this did not happen, supposedly the legend was that the body would decay and they would not be recognized and therefore not accepted into the underworld. They would not be allowed to pass through to the afterlife. Um, the main process in mummification, as we all know, was removing of liquids in the body. This was very important in order to keep the body preserved. They had to get rid of all of the liquids within the body. They started by removing organs and they started by removing the brain. They didn't really know what the brain did. They didn't care about the brain. They didn't think it was important. They thought that it was there to produce mucus for the body. So they would just throw it out. But the way that they would get it out is really interesting. Instead of just like doing a big autopsy where they'd like open up the body, instead of breaking open the head, they would take a really, really long hook and they would stick it up through your nose. I know, really gross. And then they would hook it onto your brain because your brain is like full of those little coils and stuff. And so they would pull the brain out of your nose. They would get as much of it out as they could, and then whatever they couldn't get out, they would pour a solution down your nose that would go up into your brain and sort of emulsify the brain, and then they would get rid of the liquid that was in there. Again, the brain was just thrown out. They didn't care about the brain because they thought that all of the thinking came from your heart. They thought that your heart not only pumped blood, but that it had all the thinking because it had the most blood in the body. So they thought the brain was like unimportant and they tossed it out the door. The rest of the important organs in the body, besides the heart, they would place in what are called canopic jars. And the canopic jars were jars to protect the organs until they were entering the afterlife, where they could then be reunited with the organs. The canopic jars depicted the 4 sons of Horus, which were as follows. I'm so sorry again if I'm saying any of these incorrectly. Imseti, who had a human head and guarded the liver. Happy, who had an ape head and guarded the lungs. Duamutef, who had a jackal head and guarded the stomach. And Kebhesenuf, who was hawk-headed and guarded the large and small intestines. They believed that burying them with their organs in the jars would ensure that when they entered the afterlife, they could be reunited with these organs that were protected, and then they would be able to sort of go back to their bodily functions. The body was then rinsed out with wine and sewn up with spices and very like aromatic plants left inside of the body. The heart remained in the body because they believed that once you went to enter the underworld, your heart would be weighed in the hall of judgment. So they needed the heart inside of the body before they entered the afterlife. The next step took about 30 days to complete, which is a really, really, really long process to get a body ready for burial. But again, it was so important that each step was meticulously done, because if anything went wrong, they would not be allowed into the afterlife. The body was covered in oils that were a very gold color. Part of this was because they believed that gods had skin of gold, and once you died, especially as a king, if a king, like a pharaoh, died, they were then considered to be that of a god. So they would be worshipped as such. So by making their skin golden, they were helping them resemble more of a godlike figure. And also, it helps prevent the bones and limbs from snapping while they were being mummified. And it also prevented insects and bacteria from entering the body. So all at once, they were preserving the body and also making it more aesthetically pleasing to them. They would then start wrapping the body up in linen that they would adhere with gum, which is like similar to glue. And then all of this would be done, but then this would lead to a bunch of ceremonies for the deceased person. So this isn't it. That's not it. They would then make, sarcophagi and coffins, and all this sort of stuff. For kings, they would create pyramids full of things, whatever. But they definitely had to do this next step, which is a priest would need to conduct an opening of the mouth ceremony, which was a bunch of spells, and this would ensure that they could speak and breathe in the afterlife. And if this was not done, then they would suffocate and they would not be able to speak in the afterlife. Similar spells were done to sort of reanimate the body in the afterlife, like give them control of their limbs and other body parts and things like that. Um, Huge, huge, huge amounts of food, drink, furniture, clothes, jewelry, everything you can imagine would be placed in the pyramid for these kings. And then they would be sealed up so that the king could roam about the pyramid with all of his things, and nobody else would be allowed to enter, and they would have free reign of the pyramid for themselves. One thing that's interesting to note is that in all four cultures, we see that they leave offerings for the body, which is something that I guess we still do today, if you think about it. Um, we leave like flowers by graves. A lot of people will leave, like, if you see those people that got like hit by a car on the side of the road, they'll leave like a bike with teddy bears and flowers. And like, it's not the same as leaving like food and clothes and stuff. Like, obviously, that's not something that we really do nowadays, but it is really interesting to note that we still do leave offerings today. That's something that hasn't escaped the human condition. We still have a need to sort of leave a gift for those that have departed. Just an interesting little tidbit to note. Um, if you were poor, though, the process of mummification was very different. It was sort of like getting a funeral done. They have like, this is our poorest option, our cheapest option. This is our rich people option. Pick one. And so if you were poor, you kind of had to do something different. You could have the mummification process done, but then you wrapped the body yourself in cloth and you buried it with sort of everyday objects that you would find, in these sort of mass graves in the desert. And normally they were great. They were graved. They were buried. I really can't speak English today. I am so sorry. I don't know what's going on. My brain is just like, anyway. They were normally buried in the fetal position, just to sort of save space, and it was a comfortable position for the body to be in. If the mummification process was not carried out properly, as I spoke about before, the body would end up decaying and becoming unrecognizable, making the afterlife unattainable. Death was extremely important, and therefore the burial was extremely important. This whole process took, I think, like 70 days, is what I read. I forgot to write it down, but I believe it took like 70 days to get the entire process for a body done. And they had, like, you'll see in this culture specifically, they have so many gods and goddesses of death and decay that they like worshipped on a daily basis. And some of them are really famous. Like, when I say some of them, you're going to be like, oh, I know that. So just a few of the gods, they had Osiris, who was the lord of the underworld, Isis, who is a really big part in the Osiris legend, and she also helped dead people enter the afterlife. Anubis, who I know you all know. He was a guardian of the dead, and he was the god of mummification. We have Seeker, who was the patron of the living and the dead. He was a falcon god that was sort of placed in a necropolis to sort of help those transfer over. He was supposed to be like really close to Osiris. We have Nephthys, who was Anubis' mother. She is the sister of Osiris, and she helps lead people to the underworld. She is another guardian of the dead. And then you have the four sons of Horus, like we talked about earlier, who are protectors of organs in the afterlife. So you sort of see that this culture was so focused on death. I mean, they spent most of their, legacy that they had. Like, when you look at these other cultures, you'll see that, like, for example, in Norse culture, a lot of the things that they left behind were these huge ships that they used in war and the things that they did in battle. And the legacy of the Greek culture was, democracy and all of these huge buildings and these innovations of indoor plumbing and things like that. And you look at the Mayan culture, I'm just going to talk about the ones that I talked about today. You see these huge monuments that are pyramid like, but they're temples of worship. And you see how they learned how to mine for gold and farm corn and things like that. Like, Egypt is so known for how they carried about mummification and how they dealt with death. It's interesting to note that this culture is so known for death because it was so important to them. It's one of the few cultures today that I feel like is well known, not for what they did when they were alive, but what they did when they died. Does that make sense? It's just very interesting to me to sort of note um, the fact that Egypt specifically was so focused on death, and that's what we all focus on too when we learn about it. I mean, I learned about ancient Egypt in like third grade, and I remember one of the big things we talked about, we spent like so long talking about it, was mummification and how they treated death in the culture. Um, and it was just very interesting to me because then we learned about ancient Greece, and it was more about like what they did when they were alive and the stories they told and things like that. But Egypt was just so focused on death. It was very interesting, but it wasn't a bad thing to them. You got to live on. It was almost like celebrated as long as you did it correctly. It was very interesting to sort of note the differences in each of the cultures. Like I said before, there's a ton of other really interesting, fascinating burial rituals that would happen depending on where you were, you know, in ancient times. So if you want me to do more episodes like this, please let me know because I'd totally be down to do a part 2. Um, but that's really all the information that I have today. Something really fun to note is that they all left offerings. We still do that today. Women were really important in a lot of cultures as far as funeral rites went. Like, it's just really interesting to look at stuff. I know that this is kind of morbid and you would think like, oh my God, I would never research like what people did after they died. But just realizing that it's, I mean, it's inevitable. We all know that death happens and it's going to come to us one way or another, whether it be by natural causes or murder or suicide or, however it's going to happen, it's going to happen. Um, but it's very interesting to sort of note the similarities that we have today. Like, you might consider what they did back then so ridiculous and crazy, but we do things that are very similar. We cremate people today. We bury people today. We put flowers on their grave today. Like, it's not that different. It's extremely different in the sense of we don't necessarily believe that it helps them, pass on to the afterlife or the underworld or, I'm not trying to knock anything that anybody believes in. I believe in my thing, you believe in your thing, do your thing. But I think it's just fascinating to note that we are still those same cultures, just at a higher knowledge of what the world is. But in the aspect of death, we are still just as unknowing as they are. I don't know. It's just cool to note that like you can connect with a culture that is that old off of something so macabre. I think it's just kind of beautiful in a way to be able to connect with these ancient cultures in the sense of nobody knows. And we don't know if anybody will ever know. It's just, I don't know. I find that so beautiful. Anyway, enough about that. Thank you all so much for listening to episode 2. Let me know what you guys want to hear in future episodes. I love hearing from you guys. Feel free to email me or shoot me a DM on Instagram. Both of them are at Whispers From Below. The email is at whispersfrombelow@gmail.com. No spaces, no underscores, no capitals, no nothing. Also follow the Instagram. Give a like to anything that you really like. Share the podcast. It's really the one thing that I can ask of you people to do. You can listen every week, and I absolutely love you for listening. But if you could just tell, even verbally, one person to take a listen to this podcast, it would absolutely change my life. I love doing this, and the more viewers I get, the cooler stuff I can put out for you guys, and the more content I can get out there. So if you really love this podcast and you want to see it go places the same way that I do, please share it. If you'd like to share it on social media, even just putting it on your story on Instagram, just saying like, check out this podcast, wonderful. Like that is so amazing for me. And that gets so many people interested in what I do that I'm so passionate about. Even if that makes you uncomfortable, even just verbally talking to one person and say, hey, I saw that you were watching a documentary on murderers. Like maybe you'll like at least some of the episodes in this podcast. And again, not every episode is going to be for every person. That's kind of the beauty of the podcast, is that if you are not into serial killers, but you're into stuff like this, or you love anime, there are episodes for you. There's stuff for you to listen to. You don't have to listen to every episode. If you like every episode, even better, continue to listen. I love that. But there are episodes that'll reach different audiences, and that's 100% acceptable. That's kind of the goal. I want it to reach a wider audience by getting those little niche markets. Even if it's only a couple episodes for you, that's still a couple episodes of enjoyment that you get. So continue to listen to the podcast. I'm going to be uploading every Monday at 8 a.m. and every Thursday at 8 a.m. This is Eastern time. So please keep your eye out for that. The quarantine schedule is going strong. The quarantine bonus episode is still going up every Thursday. Keep an eye out for some of the merch happening. I'm going to be posting pictures of that on Instagram. So please, please, please keep your eye out for that. And remember, ancient Egypt was wild. Leaving offerings at graves is not that weird. And wash your hands, please. You're gross.